Hello and welcome to this edition of exida Explains. I'm Dr. Steve Gandy and today's topic is going to be on the importance of conducting functional safety assessments. It's interesting that I've had many conversations with customers over the last year or so, and it's interesting that most of the time they don't really understand what the purpose of a functional safety assessment is all about, and of course what's the benefit of doing it. So hopefully this will explain a little more about why functional safety assessments are important and the benefit that they can bring for doing them. We know that functional safety applies to our safety instrumented systems, and it's based around a life cycle. And the purpose is that it's not just the planning and the designing of the safety instrumented system, it's of course the ongoing requirements to maintain it and keep up with the integrity requirements that we originally defined. Along with that, we have functional safety management that covers the entire life cycle. And the way I like to characterize this is, if you think of it as the glue that holds everything together. So if we don't follow functional safety management properly, then we can pretty quickly become unstuck. And a key part of functional safety management is being able to do these functional safety assessments. And the purpose of the functional safety assessment is really to help us with minimizing the possibility of introducing systematic failures, systematic faults into the design process as we go through. So this is the reason why we need to do these, because systematic failures ultimately lead us to potential accidents. And the HSE study that was done in 95 and 2003 identified that 42% of accidents involving safety or control systems were the result of poor specifications. So of course, if your specification is bad, your design is going to be bad and your implementation is not going to be good either. But also interestingly, 35% occurred after installation and commissioning, so during operation. And these are all characterized as being systematic. And what is systematic? Well, systematic is really the 3 Ps. We talk about people. Are people properly qualified and competent to do the work? We talk about procedures. Are there written procedures and the procedures are being followed? And finally, is there a paper trail? Can we prove that we're doing what we said we were going to do? The other piece is random failures. Now, random failures are also important because, of course, they can lead us to have failures of the equipment, typically, although people can also have random failures. You know, we can be well trained, we can be competent, we can be experienced, but our mind's not on what we're doing, we're distracted. We make a mistake. Those are random problems as well. And of course, when it comes to functional safety and probabilistic analysis, in other words, the calculations we do for our PFD average or our PFH, depending on whether it's low demand, high or continuous, these are all based around random failures. But the systematic is something that we don't always follow through on identifying and actually getting to root cause. And as I said, if you think of the 3 Ps, we could have a bad requirement specification, we could have a design fault, we could have selected a wrong component, we could have a program error, a software problem, and so forth. These can be caused by incorrect knowledge or a lack of competency, or because the process or procedure is incorrect as well. So we want to avoid those. And to help us with that, we have our functional safety management with our functional safety assessments. And we have 5 functional safety assessments that are defined in the standard. The first one occurs at the end, or should occur at the end of the analysis phase. The second one should occur after we've completed the design, before we send it to site. And the third one, which is also a mandatory one to do, is the one that we do prior to starting up, prior to introducing the hazards, running the process. And this one is required. The next one is during operation, which was added in 2016 edition as a mandatory requirement. So the standard now says we have to do a periodic performance review. The fifth one should occur before we make any changes. So if we look at the 5, the purpose again is to provide this independent cross-check on safety to help us identify and correct potential systematic issues before we get too far down the line and before it causes us a major problem. And fundamentally what we're looking at is, does the safety instrumented system meet the SRS and actually achieve safety up to this point, wherever we happen to be doing when we're doing our functional safety assessment? It needs to be done by an independent, that's a key word, independent, can be a person or persons not involved in doing the safety instrumented system design. Here again you can use qualified independent third parties, or you could use internal resources provided they're competent to do the work. And we should do them at all stages, but we must do them at 3 and 4. And as I say to the classes that I teach, these are there for a reason, so we should follow them and do them. But unfortunately, many clients I speak to haven't done a stage 1 FSA, haven't done a stage 2 FSA, and even in some cases clients are asking us to do stage 3 months or even years after they've been operating. So the functional safety assessment, the process is that we are doing this independent judgment on safety. So we need to define a procedure that's relevant to the SIL that we're trying to look at and the novelty of the design. We should appoint an experienced reviewer or team leader and team to do this, and as I said, it can either be internal or it can be external. You need to define what the scope of the assessment is going to be, of course, and create a plan for doing and reviewing. Because again, what happens if we fail the assessment? If we find some problems, what do we do next? And then if there are any safety bodies or certifications that we need to bear in mind as well, and then of course you perform the assessment. The fundamental thing is, do we really have what we need up to this point? That's what we're looking for. Some of the key items, of course, involved would be the process hazard and risk assessment, the hazard analysis, whether we used a HAZOP, a checklist, a what if, or a combination, or fault trees, whichever way we did it, did we capture that correctly? The layer protection analysis and the SIL target selection, was that done correctly? Does the safety requirements specification capture all the information we need up to the relevant point? Does the SIL meet, or rather, does the design of the SIF meet the SIL targets? Did we have evidence of doing equipment testing or acceptance testing? Do we have our O&M procedures in place? Did we train the operators beforehand? Do they know the equipment, etc.? And have we done proper validation that the equipment meets the SRS requirements, and of course the operational evidence? So if we look at the stage 1 in more detail, here we're talking about looking at evidence that the process hazard analysis was done correctly, that we have identified all the hazards properly, that the layer of protection analysis was done, and the SIL targeting was correct. Now the reason here is that oftentimes when we come to do SIL verification, we find that mistakes were made during the hazard and risk assessment or the layer of protection analysis, which resulted in either too many SIFs, or the wrong SILs, or too few SIFs. So these are also problems that need to be picked up early enough, because what it means then is that you have to go back and correct them. So the safety requirement specification, does it capture all the requirements up to this point? And is all the documentation completed? So this is all should be checked at the end of the analysis phase before we go into design. The stage 2 FSA is conducted towards the end of the design phase. And usually it's done as part of the factory acceptance testing. where the initial validation is done for the application logic with the logic solver. And here again, within the design phase, were the SIFs designed correctly? Did the SIL verification meet target? Do we have evidence of equipment selection? In other words, the equipment justification report that's required. Do we have all the hardware and software detailed requirements? Have they been completed correctly? Do we have all the documentation in place? And then the equipment acceptance tests as part of the FAT. Also at this stage we may choose to do some preliminary cybersecurity assessments to see that if we're using barrier devices or switches, that everything's hardened properly, it's not susceptible to potential incursion or malware, for example. Firewalls, have they been set up correctly? Do they have the right rule sets and so on? And then when we get to site, after we finish doing the installation and commissioning, the final pre-startup safety review is done, and as part of that the FSA 3 is done. So here we're making sure that we do have all the O&M procedures in place before we start up. We have performed the validation properly, and we've proven that the as designed installed SIS and its SIFs meet all the requirements of the SRS. So we have documentation to prove that. We've made sure that the equipment has been properly installed according to manufacturer's recommendations, that we've configured everything correctly, and we've done our final cybersecurity audit to make sure, again, the barrier devices are installed correctly, the rule sets are there, everything's fine before we start up. Because during installation commissioning, of course, we could introduce some potential vulnerabilities. So this has to be performed before we start up. But what happens if it fails? Because if this is the first one that we do, we may have had problems with the earlier phases that we didn't pick up because we didn't do the FSA 1 and we didn't do the FSA 2, but now we found them in FSA 3. So this means then that we would have to do an analysis of what that failure was and then go back to the relevant phase. This of course can result in potential costly delays. Also potential penalties if you're the engineering company and you've failed to meet the requirement for starting up by a certain date. So again, can you really afford this? What happens if the end user chooses to start up? There's nothing stopping the end user starting up, but the point there is that the end user is now accepting considerable risk. Plus, if they're not self-insured, they better check with the insurance company to make sure that the insurance company will support them. Because remember, statistically, most accidents occur during startup or maintenance activities. So if we failed our FSA 3, we really shouldn't be starting up because we're accepting a significant amount of potential risk. And the consequences could be extreme. So the next mandatory one would be the performance review. So from the point of view of IEC 61511, it is a performance-based standard. And therefore, unless we measure performance, how do we know that we're actually meeting the requirements? The standard says we have to do this periodically. It doesn't say what that period of time is, and so the end users can determine what that is. And what we're looking for is evidence of the actual performance meeting the intended performance that we originally designed for. So things like the proof test. Are we proof testing according to the SRS? Are our expected spurious trips or real trips according to what we originally thought? And of course, the mean time to fail safe, does that meet the SRS? Any failures that occurred, are we recording those correctly? Are we analyzing them to root cause? And are we segregating random from systematic? Remembering, of course, that the random numbers are the ones we will use to revalidate our calculations at some point in the future, once we've gathered enough information. So the idea is that if we do this periodic performance review, we should be able to collect the data, look at the key performance indicators, compare them to what we originally designed for, and see, are we performing better? Are we performing worse? And the idea is that with the life cycle, we have this balancing where we balance our implementation against our costs and our results. When it comes now to changes and management of change, here again, the idea behind FSA 5 is that we need to do a safety impact analysis. So somebody who is competent and responsible for doing this needs to perform that analysis prior to any changes being implemented. And this will apply to not just the hardware, but also to the application. These changes have to be authorized, and then of course we need to go back to the relevant part in the life cycle and follow through all the steps again. The same thing is true at the end of life when we come to decommission. We should treat this in the same way as part of a change approach. So how can we get good results from our FSAs? Well, one of the first things is checklists. If you have a checklist, you can make sure you don't miss anything. And of course, you can have them for each of the FSAs because the scope of the FSAs are going to be slightly different each time. I always use my pilot's analogy. Commercial pilots fly thousands of hours, and every time they get into the cockpit, they don't rely on memory. They refer to their pre-flight checklist to make sure everything's okay, and that way they don't miss anything, and of course it breeds consistency and repeatable results. Then of course we can perform using either a third party, and again here they need to be qualified to do the work, or we can use internal resources as long as they're competent and independent enough to do the work. Of course we can use software tools as long as they're fit for purpose, and we need to make sure we document everything correctly, that the documentation is available prior to doing the FSA for that particular FSA, and record the results. We also need to make sure that there's ongoing evidence of competency development, training, for example, and recording the results of that. If we follow through with that, we will have good functional safety assessments that will give us the chance to find those potential systematic issues. You can have used tools, as I said, for example, Excellencia has templates and checklists. These are all readily available if you have the tool, and this helps with making sure we're consistent again. So these are the things behind it, and remember that functional safety assessments are there for a reason. They're there to help us find potential systematic problems before we get too far down the line. So it's a necessary part of functional safety management. 1511 doesn't at the moment mandate that you do all 5, but of course, as I've said, they're there for a reason. Why would we not do them? And I know the reasons why people are not doing them, but fundamentally, it's just not helping you because you're potentially saving up problems for later on. Those systematic errors can creep in at any point, so we want to make sure we can find them. Don't wait until FSA 3 to do your first one, because then it can get very expensive if things have missed. And of course, don't start up if you fail the FSA 3, or at least don't start up unless you've got adequate mitigation or the insurance companies on your side. If you do these 5 FSAs, it can save costly rework later on. I know there'll be upfront cost in doing it, but a longer term, it will pay it back. Do your FSA 4s to monitor your performance. Again, most companies I've spoken to, at least here in the US, are not doing FSA 4s. Make use of tools and checklists for consistency. Make sure we have competent and well-trained people to be involved. And you can, of course, use qualified third parties to conduct FSAs, since the independence isn't an issue. So I hope you found that interesting and useful, and by all means let us know. Follow us on the usual Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, social media. If you have any specific questions you want to ask me, feel free. There's my email address, sgandy@exida.com. I thank you for listening and I wish you all the best.